Welcome to another Coffee with Samso Insights. Today it's all about critical metals, the two words that have been the slogan for the emerging clean energy world, the new industrial revolution for the planet Earth. For us in the mineral resource sector, this has been the go-to word to promote the industry. The low-emission world loves these two words, and in the resource-rich Australia, where we are world leaders in supplying the feedstock for the world, are we the sheep? Or should we start to be smarter with our fund allocation? Should we play our own game and be the person controlling the weather and be smart with our resources? Are all metals critical? And who are the beneficiaries of the critical nature of these metals? Should Australia look to be a more important part of the future clean energy revolution? Welcome to another Coffee with Samso Insights. We're here as usual at the UWA Club here in Crawley on the campus of University of Western Australia. And I've got Tim Craske here today. We're talking critical minerals as we've mentioned in the intro. I'll give you a bio of Tim. I basically got hold of Tim when I looked at the recent AusIMM Critical Metals conference recently, which Tim was a speaker. And Tim is a skilled and successful mineral explorer and mentor with over 40 years experience. Always good to have grey hairs. In exploration management and technical innovation, worked in Australia, North and South America, Asia and East Africa. He spent his first 20 years with Western Mining Resources, during which he discovered the Ernest Henry and E1 iron oxide copper gold IOCG deposits in the Cloncurry district, northwest Queensland. He was also involved in the targeting of the West Musgrave province for copper and nickel, pegging the core licenses on which all the deposits, Nebo, Babel and Sukov, have been found. Since leaving Western Mining, Tim has worked in both the junior and major company sectors, including exploration manager for Cyrus Resources, up to the establishment of Nova as the prime prospect. General manager, exploration consulting at Vale, and exploration manager, new commodities at Iluka Resources. Tim is managing director and chief facilitator for Tinker.events, and also a director of tinkercafe.org that specializes in developing innovative thinkers, thinking organizations, and disruptive technology solutions for industry, education, and government sectors. As you would see from the bio, Tim comes from a pedigree of Western mining people, which I hold at very high regard for, and obviously again, adds it up with Cyrus and also the Nebo prospects. Tim, welcome to Coffee with Samso.
Well, thank you.
That's one of the longest intro I've ever done for a guest.
Well, it's when you've been in the industry as long as I have, and you suddenly realise how long that is. People hark back to the Western mining and the glory days, but in reality I've been now out of Western mining longer than I was with Western mining. I was with Western for 20 years and I've been out for 24 years. So.
Well, that's called progress, I guess.
It is,
yeah.
Yes.
Look, before we get into the topic, because I think it's a fascinating topic, especially with your experience, can you just share with us your background, your journey into the mineral sector, and just give us a summarized version of the long version?
Okay, yeah. Well, I started off as a geologist because I couldn't see myself doing any of the major sciences that I'd study at school, and I was lucky to get into Imperial College when it was the Royal School of Mines. So that was a very good grounding in geology, and in those days, unlike present courses, there was an awful lot of field work because people didn't worry too much about insurance and permitting and other things. They just went off and wandered around on footpaths in the UK and on the continent and looked at rocks. So that was my background. Joined Western Mining in 1981. My first job was in Bendigo, looking for gold. But then I moved to Western Australia for the first time. And that was mine geologist at Mount Windara mine when that was going as a joint venture with Shell. Then I moved from there to work in the Paddison Basin for around Nifty for base metals, and then to Queensland, where I was lucky enough to be exploring in the Eastern Succession. But the story there that I might emphasise is that we had 4 years of no success whatsoever, and it was the last roll of the dice, if you like, that took us north of Cloncurry to under the Black Soil Plains, and that was where the opportunities really were. So that speaks a bit to persistence. It also speaks to luck. I'm a great believer in luck, but luck is serendipity, not fate. It's something you make. So Western Mining had a lucky culture. So as well as being technically excellent, they also created luck for themselves by the culture that Roy Woodall primarily had built over the years.
Yeah, look, over the 5 years of Coffee with Samso, I've learned that, and through my studies, especially in my 30 years in this industry, that the Western mining era seems to be an incubator of a lot of present thinkers that are out there in the mineral industry, mineral exploration especially now. Do you think your experience in Western mining is a major influence in how you think, or was it
yes,
just the
absolutely.
seed that came up?
So I was lucky enough to become one of Douglas Haynes's mentees in my mid to late 20s. So when I moved to Townsville, he was mentoring me from then on. And Douglas was chief geologist at that stage, but most people would know that he was heavily involved with the mineral systems ideas that led to the discovery of Olympic Dam. So the connection there goes back and forward. So whilst obviously he left Western Mine even before I did, he went to go to BHP. But that opportunity to think in a holistic space is probably why I'm where I am today. So it set me on the path of two things. One was being interested in the process of thinking and how you come up with ideas and how you do really effective critical thinking, and not many people are very good at that. They do analytical thinking, breaking everything down, but actually working out what you're not being told, working out what's missing, and trying to put it all into a answering question why, then that's something that you learn very much by experience. And so I was lucky enough to stay with Western Mine for 20 years, had a number of opportunities, including moving to Denver, Colorado, as my kind of last gig with them. But it was after that, so when I left, I actually looked into becoming a full-time business coach and studied with a guy in the UK. In the end, I decided not to take up his franchise because I didn't like the agreement that he handed me. But it's something that set me on that path. So I've been mentoring people in the industry since 2002, and some of those people have been Western Mining people, ex-Western Mining people, many of them not. And some of them have been the CEOs of some of our most successful medium-sized companies.
Okay. Look, the topic critical metals or critical minerals is on everyone's lips. It's making a lot of media attention. When we first met up to first discuss, we had a lengthy conversation, and you would have another hour episode there. And I've always been saying, it should be essential minerals, kind of make it more of a sense of what really it should mean. And I know you have your view on the topic and your thoughts on meaning and how it should be in our Australian resource sector. So far away.
Well, if those of you who have the opportunity to watch the video of my talk in Queensland at the Critical Minerals Conference there, will understand that I started off that talk by essentially analysing or thinking critically about critical minerals. So Australia says that it has 31 critical and strategic minerals, but the fact is that it lumps all of the rare earths as one. But the Americans are a bit more honest. They actually split out every rare earth, and so they have 51 critical and strategic minerals. There are only 117 elements in the periodic table, so now we're already getting close to half. If you add in some of the things that the Europeans think are critical, because they don't have them, then you end up at about 60. Now, if you look at the periodic table and you take off all the halogens, which are liquids and gases, and you take off the noble gases except helium. Helium is a critical gas. And you take off the major metals like iron and the base metals. What you're left with, everything else that then isn't on the critical list, a liquid gas or a major metal, is radioactive. So what really we are saying is that everything's critical. And when everything's critical, nothing's critical, because you have no focus. And for me, that's potentially disastrous, because then you can have a situation where people believe that, well, this is on a list, I'm going to go exploring for this, or I'm going to develop a business around this, and actually there is no business there to be developed, because it's just a list of everything. And what's really critical? Well, if we actually reflect on how this all came about, from COVID and supply chains and the energy transition, there's really only one metal that's critical to that, and that's copper. And if all our junior explorers are out looking for the obscure backwaters of the periodic table, they're not looking for copper. And we're going to be desperately short of copper going forward at the way things are currently panning out. So to me, the danger is that the critical minerals as a concept becomes a distraction from what we actually really need to do. And in fact, when I was in Queensland, people may find this a bit amusing, but people came up to me and said, well, why isn't coal on the list? And you go, well, isn't that so totally against the concept of transition? And they said, well, no, because coking coal is still required, and people who think that they're going to make steel with hydrogen alone are kidding themselves, because they're not metallurgists and they don't know the processes, and it won't happen unless you've got bulk carbon like coal.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the interesting thing you said, because recently I saw article, there was a coking coal project in the UK that just got knocked on the head.
Well, that again is a total disaster in the way that governments manage public expectations. So it was people saw it as a coal mine, therefore it was bad. So coal, old king coal, is a bad thing. Can't have coal mines anymore. In fact, a lot of people would like us to turn off the gas as well. But let's just focus on coal. Well, there is no replacement for coking coal at the moment for making steel. And if you're going to make steel in the UK, wouldn't you be better off mining your own coking coal when you've got a deposit that's quite economically viable, rather than importing it from Queensland? If you think about the environmental impact of sticking coking coal on a boat from Queensland and sending it essentially to the other side of the world, that's what's going to happen. So you haven't actually solved anything, you've just transferred the problem somewhere else, and guess what? The whole of the world's atmosphere is interconnected, and it doesn't matter where the CO2 goes in, it affects everybody.
Well, that's the disconnect I find with the whole clean energy, carbon footprint conversation, is that, that they don't take into where this thing, how it transport, because they say, oh, no, you have to take account of all this. But when it goes against the question, they forget that there's carbon costs from transporting these things, digging it up, the equipment used. If you want to add it all up, let's put everything on the table.
Yeah.
But I find that there's that disconnect of, and it kind of makes me wonder whether this whole thing is a business someone dreamed up one day and said, it's a great way of making money, this new carbon credit system that we will implement for the world. I mean, a very cynical view of it, but you kind of wonder, well, like now the lithium story kind of turned down a bit, and so...
Well, maybe we should move on to that. So, I refer to the lithium story as the lithium lemmings, who are now all jumping off the cliff into the ocean, and maybe prematurely, because what we've seen, or what we see with these very small and controlled markets, I mean, the LME does not buy and sell lithium, or the lithium chemicals. It's by contracts with the end users. And this is very similar to what Iluka has been doing for years with selling its zircon and rutile, or titanium dioxide, into the market, in global market. Now, in those two commodities, Australia is like Saudi Arabia. We control that market so much that Iluka can, when the prices go down, they simply turn back their operations or stockpile it and maintain the price. But in lithium, because lithium is one of the most abundant elements on the planet, so it's definitely not rare, it means that as soon as there's a supply overreach, the price crashes back down. Now, people say, oh, it's very low at the moment, but it's not. If you take the spike out, the price spike that we experienced in the last 12, 18 months, then it's actually on trend with what it was doing before.
Yeah.
So the long-term trend should be a very marginal business in lithium, because it's everywhere. And it's just how much energy you want to use and how much capital do you want to use to get it out. There's lithium in oil wells, so even the oil industry is talking about getting lithium out of oil field brines. You've got these salars in South America, you've got jadarite in Serbia, you've got it's essentially on every single continent on the planet. And therefore there is nothing critical about lithium. It's just flavor of the month. And what we've seen in battery metal chemistries is that, first of all, we saw cobalt disappearing from batteries because $60,000 a ton, nobody wanted to stick in a battery. Then nickel, and the next one might be lithium, because they're talking about salt batteries, which will use sodium. And guess what? Sodium is really plentiful in the ocean.
Yeah, I guess, one of the things that come to mind, and I think we touched it on as well, and you made it in the comments, is this that should we adopt an Indonesian model of value adding downstream industry, or should this be a time where Australia goes, here's a good time for us to do this now, there's a lull in the market, we've got all these raw materials at our hands, should we invest in creating a downstream process for all these materials?
Well, it's a really, really good question, because that's what the government is saying, that's what the CSIRO is saying. It's the CSIRO documents on critical minerals opportunities in Australia, and they described it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change the way that we do business in our mineral sector, to actually do downstream processing, to do value adding, and maybe even do manufacturing in country. So maybe making batteries or battery electrolytes or whatever it might be. So that all sounds fine until you look at where Australia is, the expectations that people have, especially in the mining industry, of what they're going to get paid to go to work, and energy. Now, the reason why Indonesia has stolen the nickel chalice from the rest of the world is because they, first of all, have invested, or the Chinese have invested in an industrial complex that's 10 times bigger than Kwinana. And secondly, that they're using coal, and it's poor quality coal, and they're burning that to create low cost energy, which is something that we wouldn't do. So in order to compete with the Indonesians, for example, we would have to behave more like them. And if we say we're not prepared to do that, then that immediately means we're not in the game anymore, because they are prepared to do that and we're not. And unfortunately, there is no concept of green nickel out there in the marketplace. You get no premium for making nickel in any other way, one way or another.
So on that topic, I mean, again, I was away for 17 days, so I had a lot of time to read. There was talks of the Americans saying to Indonesia, hey, you know, you guys been naughty boys, we might want to ban your nickel. Do you think that's something possible in the near or medium term?
Well, it's one of the things that I teach in my thinking business is systems thinking. So you have to understand that when you destabilize a system that's working under normal circumstances, so let's think about the mineral supply chain. There's supply and demand, and there's scarcity, and there's transport and all these other things, and that's what sets the price. So things that are really scarce, like gold and platinum elements, they're very high value. Things which are plentiful, like iron ore, they're very relatively low value, and that's what sets the business model. So where do we think we're really going here? If you ban, as the Americans have recently, let's put 100% tariff on Chinese cars, electric cars. What's that going to do? Well, the Chinese aren't going to stop making electric cars just because America stops buying them. They're going to sell those cars even cheaper into other markets to keep their business going. Now the Americans won't be able to sell their cars anywhere because the Chinese have totally undercut them in every other market. So then, our friends in Europe will jump in as well. So you've got 500 million people in Europe, and you've got nearly 300 million people in North America. Well, that's a very tiny fraction of the world's population. Sorry. So you haven't done anything. And it's a bit like saying, to Putin now, we're going to put sanctions on you, and all that Putin does, I'll sell my oil and gas to the Chinese. So you disturb the system, and the system simply absorbs that disturbance and goes back to equilibrium again. And then you go, so what do we do next? Well, you haven't. You just pulled the big trigger, and you've also closed down any possibility of negotiation or dialogue. So much better to go in on a diplomatic basis and say, look, we don't quite like what you guys are doing. We don't like the fact that you're cutting down the rainforest to mine the nickel, and we don't like the fact that you're sticking all this carbon into the earth. So we want to do the same as we do in the Amazon. We're going to protect this. We're going to buy it off you. And we're going to give you a large amount of money to shut you down.
So what's the alternative? I mean, obviously, Australia's never going to be able to do the kind of stuff we see in Indonesia or, in Africa or whatever. No. We have cheap labour and not so much concern for the environment and things like that. Right? There's no foreseeable path to that direction.
No.
So what is Australia's solution? What should we be focusing on?
Well, we do have enormous opportunity. I mean, Australia is still the lucky country. We have an entire continent with rocks of every age, from the oldest Archean rocks through to the youngest volcanics and sediments. And so there's nothing that we as in Australia is critical for us. We have everything. Then the question is, well, what do we actually want to do? So at the moment, Australia is an iron ore, coal, natural gas, gold, mining country. We also mine base metals in large amounts. So we're a significant player in lead and zinc and copper. But after that, that's pretty much it. And all of those commodities, apart from the base metals, get shipped offshore as raw ore or concentrate. So people ask, well, why are the Chinese producing this long list of things like gallium and germanium and all these other things? And you really have to ask yourself, well, back when Clinton was president, the Americans essentially exported their industrial base to China. And if you're going to make things in China, aren't you going to secure all of the things you need to make things with? And Chinese don't just make ordinary things. They don't just make China, and they make iPhones and Tesla cars and computers and all these other things. So they need all of the things. And so when people think of the Chinese as having weaponized rare earths and turned off supply, if you flip it around, the Chinese were simply securing their own supplies to make sure that their industries had the upper hand. It's no different to what the Americans would do. It's no different to what the Europeans would do. It's just because it's China, we label it as weaponization, and it's.
So do you see that as a fault of media, or because the perception from the West, Australia, and when I go to Asia of China is night and day. So China's very passive and helpful. China's very bad, angry, dangerous when I'm in Australia. Do you see that? Do you think that is like what you've just explained, right? Because you can see it as weaponized, or you can see it as I'm just securing my business. Do you see? Do you think that the same? That there is some sort of.
Well, let's go back. Let's go back to the end of the Second World War. The fact is that China is still a communist country. Therefore, Americans think China is bad, the same as they think Russia is bad. Okay? So if you're a communist, you're bad. Doesn't matter what you do otherwise, but if you have a command economy, you're the bad guys. And so it doesn't really matter what China does or Russia does. They'll always be labelled by the Americans as bad, and the UK and Australia simply follow whatever the Americans follow, because that's where our defence links are. Yet, as we all know, without China, the West Australian economy would collapse.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, we want Chinese to buy our products, but at the same time, we're trying to hit them with a big stick provided by America. And it defies logic, and it's one of the few things I agree with Paul Keating on, is that this is not the way to deal with China. As I was saying earlier, it's not the way to deal with Indonesia to ban their product, because you never will. It's like trying to ban conflict diamonds. So just find another way out of Africa or another way out of Indonesia. And if you do, well, excuse me, where are you going to get all this nickel from? Without Indonesian nickel, we won't have enough nickel.
Do you think there is an issue of the old colonisation concept of it's okay for us but not okay for you? Because it's like telling the Indonesians you can't do this because you can't make all this good money because you're doing this, but they're saying, well, that's the only way we can do it.
Yeah.
That's the way that we see best. Because don't forget, the Americans, the Western world, you want to call it, did do the same things before,
Oh, yeah.
but now it's okay because
And it was okay too when if you say that there's a war on. So one of the benefits of calling the Cold War, and that some people have labelled what's currently going on with China as the new Cold War. If that's, as soon as you say war, it allows you to do whatever you like.
yeah, well,
Now, as President of the United States, you can press the big red button if you want to, because it's war.
yeah.
And we can tell people what to do instead of asking them.
So,
And
yeah.
I find that very counterproductive in the modern world to think that way. You can't control other people through threats anymore. You need to coerce them with love.
So coming back to, the metals and the critical metals, as you were saying before, there is certain things that are critical to Australia, but not the rest of the world. We should focus on what we need, because in some ways, if you look at the potential implosion of the real estate industry in China, which hasn't imploded, which is everyone in Asia's, Southeast Asia's fearing it imploding, because they reckon if it did fully implode, it would be many times the GFC.
Right.
And what would that mean to Australia in terms of resources, our metals, our iron ore, those kind of things, right? And so where do you think we should be focused, assuming that that's going to be probably the only place you could manage such a sizable potential implosion is in China?
Yeah.
And so where do you see us? Where should we be focusing our search? Because, we established the fact that let's not explore for everything under the sun. Let's not explore for every commodity that's supposed to be critical. So what's your top 3, top 5 places we should be?
Okay. So within Australia?
Yeah.
Yeah. So within Australia, well, unfortunately, deposits, and particularly world-class deposits or tier 1 deposits, they aren't where you want them. They just are where they occur. So you have to live with that. So you have to be realistic, and the same is true about commodity suites. So if you have, if you're interested in copper, well, copper doesn't just hang around usually on its own. It's either copper gold or copper silver or copper moly or something else. You get other elements as well. So the real question then is, well, what do we actually want with the copper? And at the moment, you'd have to say it's copper gold, because gold is sky high price-wise. So that's going to help underwrite your capital. In fact, you may well be able to sell the gold as a royalty and finance your business through a royalty sale to somebody. So that's one, and as I said, to me, that is the most critical metal of all. And the only trouble with that is if you actually look at it from a greenhouse perspective, is that the mining of copper produces more greenhouse gases than any other metal.
I don't say that.
Because the amount that we mine and the low grades that we mine and the amount of rock we have to move and crush and process means it's environmentally an extraordinarily important metal. But without it, you can't go green. So it's like you're caught in this catch-22, is that if you don't mine it, you can't go green, and if you do mine it, you're not being green in the meantime.
So you're hoping you're more green than not green, and
you've got to balance things,
positive.
and we need to get real, and this is where the press is completely, sort of don't just answer them at all. We're talking about net zero, not absolute zero.
Yeah.
So if we need something, and that involves us emitting some CO2 to get it, then we need to balance that with something that absorbs the CO2.
Yeah.
We don't go, you can't do this anymore. And as soon as we start putting these hard rules like no more coking coal mining, no this, no export of gas, no gas projects in Australia anymore, none of this, we're just signing up for the end of civilization as we know it, because that's not the way the world works, because the rest of the world will go, well, we don't care about that. We already see it. Indonesia's got a population of, what, 280 million people? If they want to burn coal, they'll burn coal.
Yeah.
If the Chinese want to burn coal, and they'll burn coal. If the Indians want to burn coal, they'll burn coal.
Yeah. I think the higher, I don't know whether this is the right word, the high intellect, the higher level of movers and shakers understand the whole concept of net emission, whereas the rest of a lot of the people still think there is a possibility of zero emission, because I don't think zero will happen, because, as you just said, there's going to be a balancing act.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Southeast Asian nations with a lot of positive carbon, but they still need base load power.
Yeah.
And base load power in Asia is not going to come from the sun. It's going to come from something.
Yeah.
And that
It's
would be
cloudy.
coal.
Yeah.
You know, so they've got hydro and thing, but that's never going to be
No.
that fantastic. And you know, not long ago, hydro was a environmental hazard to
Well, it is.
build one, right?
You flood vast
Yeah, and
areas with hydro.
correct. And then when the Chinese was building the Three Gorges, everyone was up in arms. But now it's the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
I think it's powering like 22,000 megawatts or some massive number,
Yeah.
and that's seen as a positive thing now, as opposed to before it was a negative thing.
So there is balance.
Yeah.
There needs to be balance. But getting back to the issue of Indonesia and nickel, just as one example. So the real reason why the Indonesians will be able to stick nickel out at $16,000 a ton and we can't make any money at that price is because of the cheap energy.
Yeah.
Because lateritic nickel takes a large amount of energy to extract it. And even if you make nickel pig iron, then you've got to refine that nickel pig iron to make all the nickel chemicals and the nickel for stainless steel. If you want high quality stainless steel, not the sort of stuff that you get that has all the tea stains on it when you leave it out in the elements in Perth, you know.
Yeah.
A little bit of salt air and everything's going a little bit rusty, even though it's supposed to be stainless steel. So we kid ourselves that we're focusing on the wrong thing. It's not about the metal, it's about the energy. So,
yeah.
if, for example, just thought bubble here, we put a nuclear power station in the Pilbara and another one out at Kalgoorlie, and we supplied that power for next to nothing, and otherwise the government funds the capital cost of building those things, we would then be on par with Indonesia.
Well, that's a good concept. I mean,
And you go, well, where's that money going to come from, Tim? Well, just cancel one of the submarines.
yeah.
You know, those things are so expensive, you can build several nuclear power plants with the cost of one submarine.
Yeah, I was actually, that's put a damper on my next question, because you know, if you put a nuclear power in Kalgoorlie or the Pilbara, you would probably save a lot. A lot of projects would become viable because of the cheap energy, and so. But the next question would be to be competitive in, you know, thinking about this potential future downstream industry for Australia. Do you think the guys out here should be chasing those tier one projects, as opposed to those smaller ones where they're actually just doing it for the market? So there's the need for the market to have these stories pumping out, but those tier one stories, the you know, Olympic Dam, the Nebos, the Nova Bollingers, they don't come every day. They don't come every year. They don't come every decade. But then also they're not very attractive to the market because it takes such a long gestation period from receiving the money and having something at the end, right?
Yes.
So do you think there should be a shift there?
Well, it
Or
really
thinking
depends.
anyway?
Well, no, what is the purpose of mining? So the original purpose of mining historically was not for metal, it was for ochres, for body paint. So the origin of mining is actually cultural. It's got nothing to do with metal. Later on, somebody found that when you stuck these colourful minerals in the fire, you ended up with some metal. And that was the dawn of metallurgy and the dawn of the Bronze Age. And then it all took off from there. But in the modern sense, what is the purpose of mining in Australia? Well, it's to create wealth. And without it, we wouldn't be wealthy. The mining and petroleum is what supports the lifestyle of Australia. Without that, we would literally be again, to take from Paul Keating, the banana republic, because we know base load wealth creation. Now, tier 1 deposits create 65 to 70% of the wealth. So although they're rare, because of their scale and all of the support that they require, the railways, the towns, the infrastructure, the power, all the rest, they create that much more wealth. So in the last 30 years, there have only been 11, maybe not even 11, 10, let's call it 10 because it makes the maths, 10 tier 1 discoveries in Australia. So that's 1 every 3 years on average. And it now takes 10 to 15 years minimum from discovery to get a big project up and running. In fact, many of them it's 20 years. Some, to be honest, like the Olympic Dam, it didn't make any money for the first 30, 40 years of its existence. So in terms of putting these really big projects on, it's a big capital expenditure and then all the rest, but a lot of the delays, the reason why it takes 10 to 15 years, not 5, is all self-imposed. It's government regulation. And so if we could streamline that, so if government became a facilitator rather than a blocker, and what we've seen recently in New South Wales is a classic example, a company that has all the permits ready to go and some minister comes in over the top and says no. And that's, if we behave like that, then nobody's going to be prepared to stump up the money. Now, at the small end of the market, well, can small explorers afford to explore for tier 1 deposits? And the answer is yes and no. One is because they are 50% of the exploration spend or more, they have to. Because if they're not, nobody else is. And the other side of it, can they ever dream of putting one of those in production? No. And many of the opportunities that they actually take forward are things much, much smaller than that, which provide cash flow to keep them going. So they can put a small gold mine into production, or they can produce some copper concentrate and ship it out, create some cash flow, keep their exploration arms going to find the big one. But it's a really hard job, and overall the industry in Australia barely makes any money, and in many other countries like Canada it loses money. So for every dollar invested in Canada, they get about 65 cents back in discoveries. In Australia, at the moment it's around about $1, but that's only because we renewed the search space with the lithium and rare earth boom. Without converting some of these tantalum mines into lithium conglomerates, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I mean, there's enormous amount of money raised during that lithium boom. I think it's over $1 billion or something like that, and you still got the same number of lithium mines, and only 2, Azure and Liontown considered new. Greenbushes and Wodgena's not new.
No.
Pilbara's, I guess new.
But
that's
not
5.
Really, yeah.
Well, not really, exactly. Yeah. So that's 5.
That's 5 out of the 10.
And only 3 of them are really mining.
So that's the thing, is that each one of those is world-class mine. So I said there were 10 world-class discoveries. Yeah. Now you take those 5 off the table, you only left with 5 world-class discoveries in the last 30 years.
Yeah. Well,
these ones were discovered by converting an existing opportunity and just changing the element.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aha. Yeah. We're now going to be a lithium mine instead of a tantalum mine or a tin mine.
Azure was supposed to be a nickel mine. But
Azure, they were looking for nickel, but Azure will almost certainly go because of its location on the coast. I mean, it'll be one of the lowest cost producers for sure.
yeah,
Greenbush is the lowest cost producer in the world because of its grade. It's so much better than any of the others, and there's a reason for that. And the ones that are in the middle, well, they're the ones that have shut down.
yeah. One of the issues with our industry, I guess I say our because I'm on in the same boat, a company in the mineral explorations space, is that to raise this kind of money to go and test a concept, very rare, very difficult,
Yeah.
and in this market especially, it's extremely difficult. But that's what will happen, right? Yeah, unless you need to create your own luck, and you know to spend that money to create that luck. Your Cyrus was, a fantastic story and stroke of luck, I guess, in some ways, or not. The famous tale was that the last 60 grand or whatever.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of
got
examples of
got
that.
got the
And
thing, right?
Chris Bonwick was running IGO on his own personal credit card at one stage. So there's plenty of stories like that in the industry where the CEOs have been basically bankrolling the company to get it over the line to the next stage. But that's where self-belief comes in, and some of the people who are true believers are to our industry what people like Steve Jobs was to the IT sector, is that they so totally and utterly believe in what they're doing and their abilities to make it happen that it happens.
Yeah. So, trying to round off and summarise and get back on track because we've kind of meandered a bit in the middle there. The energy transition set in concrete, right? As much as what theories or cynical views one may have, it's going forward. And coal's a dirty word.
Yeah.
Petroleum's a dirty word. So, do you see Australia? I mean, we touched on this. Do you see Australia having an ability to develop that downstream process that could make us the Australian story, the China/Australian story? Because China's kind of like quietened down a bit now.
Yeah.
But that 30-year growth, right, 30+ year growth was massive. It was transitioning from where China was to where China is today.
Sure.
Do you think Australia could somehow steal that, or maybe get a bigger bite of it and make Australia transition?
Well, if we look at the past, which is always where you should go to before you try to predict the future. In the past, we have tried to do things like produce steel in Australia, and it's not viable. We have in the past, what we are currently producing, we produce copper ingots, we produce lead and zinc ingots, so those are final products that can be shipped around the world, but we don't have an industrial base to use those products. So then you have to say, well, what is Australia's industrial base going to be, and why are we going to need all of this stuff that we dig out of the ground ourselves? Because without that, you're still exporting this intermediate product, or even a final product. But say we have a battery plant down at Bunbury or somewhere, you've still got to find a market for that. And if somebody can do it cheaper or differently, then there's a risk there. And all of these industrial plants and downstream processing, let's take Lynas as an example with rare earths, incredibly capitally intensive. That's actually getting the processes to work, going from the lab to the mass scale. It's very, very difficult, much more difficult than people realize. And so who's going to provide that capital, or who's going to risk their money? Especially in Australia, the mums and dads can currently get 20% by buying some real estate.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
it's safe as houses. You
Yeah.
know, why would you risk your money on the stock market? All of the lithium stocks and rare earth stocks that I invested in since since COVID, not the GFC, since COVID, are all a fraction of what I paid for them. So I've lost heaps of money, and I thought, like a lot of people, that they would. I'd ride this wave. I'd kind of missed the lithium wave, but I thought, oh, rare earths, that's the next big thing. No, in fact, only yesterday I heard that Dreadnought were making geologists redundant. So we're in a downwards cycle, some might even say spiral, for some of these supposedly critical mineral producers. They're either going into hibernation, or they're going bust, or they're sacking their workforces, and in some cases they may never ever come back again.
Yeah, the rare earth was an interesting one, and that's more I learned about it, the more difficult it appears.
Well, the Mountain Well, they mine 25% plus rare earths. So when somebody said they got 1 to 3%, you really have to laugh.
Or less.
Or less in some cases. You
Yeah.
know, and fair enough. If it's an ionic clay and you can basically wash it out of the clay, then that might be a goer. But who's going to actually let you strip mine the area around National Park at Esperance to dig up clays and destroy the environment in the process? I don't know that you're going to get a permit to do that.
So what do you see, obviously we had that big run in just after COVID, and everyone thought that was the way the industry is, and people like you and I who've been in industry long time, we know that was an anomalous period of time, a bit like finding a geophysical anomaly, and now we're kind of like back where we were. What do you think could spark this? Because there's always a spark that created a run. What do you think that spark is, potentially?
Well, first of all, let me say from the outset, I am not a critical minerals denier. Okay, I'm not a climate change denier. I believe that there are minerals that are critical for the energy transition. They're just not the ones we're focusing on. When we go off to the corners of the periodic table, where we're basically extracting stuff from as byproduct sludge from our other processes, well, we can do that anyway. We don't actually have to think about that. If the prices of those products become high enough, people will extract them.
Yep.
But if they're not, then they will go to the tailings dam,
Yep.
which is where they belong.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
if because you can't, because mining companies won't go, oh well, this might be valuable in 25 years' time, so I'll stick it in this special tank over here, because that costs money to do that. They'll just send it all out with the rest, and then it's lost or it's diluted. But focus is key, and throwing confetti up, hoping that somebody underneath is going to get married, is not the way to manage funding critical minerals.
Yep.
We have to think about the downstream. It has to be integrated, and it has to be led by people who can lead that. And it's not going to be led by the major mining companies, because they're not interested in critical minerals.
It's not their business.
Rio Tinto maybe a little bit in lithium, but BHP absolutely not.
Yeah.
And so, where is that all going to come from? It's all going to come from government or nobody. Or it's going to come from overseas investment. And guess what? Chinese would love to come and invest in our critical minerals sector because they're the ones who actually need the products more than anybody else. They're the ones with the massive manufacturing base. And if it's not them, then you could say, okay, well, the US still has a moderate manufacturing base, and so does Europe. But some of the rules and regulations that those countries have tied themselves up with is that, for example, a car produced in the UK is in danger of not being able to be sold into Europe because the value of the battery is over 25% of the value of the car, and the battery comes from China. All of a sudden now, you paying a tariff to sell a car that had no tariff on it yesterday.
Yeah, I think the world needs to understand the Chinese thinking. They don't want to dominate the world. They just want to make money
Yeah.
and protect their wealth.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good way to sort of summarize our discussion is that investment has to come from someone large, being the government,
Yeah.
or foreign investment. And just at this point in time, Chinese have been the biggest investors on the planet.
And a government loan is not a government gift.
Correct.
So people think, oh, the government is putting billions into critical minerals. Yes, you can go and get a loan at low rates from the government where you can't get one from the bank. But why would you borrow money to produce metals that you can't sell?
Can't sell, yeah. And don't forget that loan is not a easy loan. If you've spoken to anyone that's gone to get those loans, they're not easy to get. The hurdles you have to cross are no different to a commercial bank.
Indeed.
So it's a number. It's almost I feel like it's more of a political talk than a realistic pathway.
I think the danger for us as an industry, as a mining industry, is that if we treat the world critical in the same way as we treat the word climate, then we are going absolutely down the wrong path. Metals don't suddenly become good because somebody docked them with some rose water and says you are now critical. When the government made nickel a critical mineral, I despaired, because it's not. It's a major metal.
Yeah.
It's bought and sold on the LME. It's not a critical mineral.
Yeah. And I think that's a good takeaway for a lot of guys out there, is that it's saying, as you said, you're not a critical metals denier or climate change deniers. We just need to be a bit smarter in how we
and this is
put
the
our money.
critical thinking that we have to all use. What are we not being told? What are we not thinking about? And these tiny little markets are more dangerous, more fluctuations, more supply and demand overruns, all of these things that we've experienced with other commodities, times 10. So why would anybody lend you any money to get into them? I wouldn't. If I was a bank, I wouldn't lend you any money.
Great, Tim. I mean, it's a topic really that allows us to meander on different on different levels, different spectrums. To finish it off, what's your last words, your prophecy that you want to put out there?
Well, if I'm talking to the Australian mineral sector, I'd say, well, look, you've got to look at what we are good at and what we have. And outside of the major metals, then you have to say there's an awful lot of mafic rocks in Australia, which will come with nickel and copper, and they will also come with titanium and vanadium, and they will also come with chrome, and they will also come with platinum group metals. We also seem to have been fairly good at finding carbonatites, which will come with their suite of metals. And beyond that, well, the rest are mostly byproducts of other processes, like the slimes from electrolysis to produce copper. So we can produce those if it's viable. Maybe we need some high-grade silica to produce the new round of solar panels. I don't know, especially if you're going to build massive solar farms. But I caution you, in an environment where we're saying that the weather is going to become more extreme, all those solar farms and wind farms are all going to get blown away in the first massive super cyclone that comes through, a category 6 that we've never seen before. And that's what's already happened in the States. There have been large renewable energy farms that have been wiped out by extreme weather. That won't happen with a nuclear power station, by the way, unless you build it on a fault and have a tsunami come in on top. But if you build it somewhere sensible, it's actually one of the most secure and safest forms of energy. And people say, oh, no, it'll take too long. Well, in Dubai, 5.5 years to build one. And if you're not into that, what's going to happen when nuclear fusion comes along? Are you going to say, oh, we're not interested in nuclear fusion? Because if you're not interested in that, you're not interested in sunshine.
That's a good way to finish the conversation, because that will create a lot of question marks and for people out there. So, look, Tim, thanks for your time.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I'd love to have you back again, because I think those are the questions that a lot of people may be talking about, but they never really looked at the ins and outs of it. You know, your parting comments about nuclear energy is, it's probably on cue, but again, that creates another wave of questions and negative thoughts, rightly or wrongly. But anyway, thank you, and hope to have a chat again in future.
Thanks, Noel.